One day, a 19-year-old girl was auctioned in the marketplace, and no one in the crowd stood up to stop her. Elara Quinn was handcuffed, pushed onto a wooden platform in broad daylight, while the surrounding men bid as if she were a horse or a piece of land. Her uncle sold her to pay off his gambling debt. The town knows it. And the town remained silent. But Elara Quinn did not bow her head. She raised her face to look directly at each person in the crowd, and it almost cost her her life. Click like and comment with the name of the city you are viewing so I know how far this story has come. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next part, because this is just the beginning. The morning Black Hollow held its auction, the sky was the color of a bad bruise, purple and yellow at the edges, threatening nothing but more heat and more dust. It was the kind of morning that didn't apologize for itself. Elara Quinn had been awake since before the sun came up. Not by choice. Two of her uncle's men had come for her in the dark, and they hadn't bothered to knock. She'd fought them. That was the first thing worth knowing about her. She fought. Not with any particular skill, not with training or technique, but with the raw, clawing desperation of someone who understood exactly what was happening and refused to pretend otherwise. She'd broken a knuckle on the taller one's jaw and earned a split lip for the trouble. By the time they dragged her into the street, her dress was torn at the sleeve and her hair had come half loose from its braid, and she was breathing through her nose because her mouth hurt too much to open wide. Her uncle, Dade Quinn, watched from the doorway of his house as they took her. He didn't come out. He stood with his arms crossed and his eyes somewhere on the middle distance, the way a man looks when he's already made a decision and doesn't want to revisit it. He was a heavy-set man with a red face and small eyes, and he'd smelled of whiskey since before Elara could remember. She looked back at him once. He looked away first. Black Hollow was not a large town, but it had the quality of a town that had grown faster than its conscience. It had a main street broad enough for two wagons to pass each other without argument, a handful of storefronts with wooden awnings, a saloon called the Copper Bell that did most of its business before noon, and a sheriff's office that might as well have been a storage room for all the law it produced. The population was somewhere between 300 and 400 people depending on who was passing through and who had recently left in a hurry. It sat at the edge of a dry river valley in a part of the territory that hadn't yet decided what it wanted to become, settled or savage, lawful or otherwise. Most mornings, the auction platform in the center of town was used for livestock. This morning, it was not. They stood her up on the boards at 8:30. The wood was rough-hewn and she could feel the splinters through the soles of her shoes. Someone had driven a post into the center of the platform and tied a rope to it, and the other end of that rope was looped around her wrists in a knot she'd already tested twice. It held. She counted the crowd because it gave her something to do besides panic. 31 people. Maybe more along the edges. Men mostly, in the rough working clothes of ranchers and laborers. A few in the slightly cleaner gear of merchants and traders. A handful of women near the back who had the expressions of people watching something they knew was wrong and had decided not to be involved with. Two boys, maybe 12 or 13, who'd climbed up on a fence post for a better view until a woman yanked them down. At the front of the crowd stood a man named Cassidy Boone. Boone owned the largest cattle operation in the valley, a spread of land called the Ironwood, and he owned a significant portion of the town's debt besides. He was tall and lean, in the way of men who'd been hard-worked in their youth, and now paid other people to do it, with a silver mustache and the particular confidence of someone who'd never been told no by anyone he considered worth listening to. He wore a good coat despite the heat. He had a way of standing with his feet slightly apart and his thumbs in his belt that made him look like he was posing for a painting he'd already commissioned. Beside him stood two of his men. They were not subtle. The man running the auction was a person Elara had never seen before. A small, quick-moving figure in a brown vest who spoke in a rapid, rehearsed patter that made the whole proceeding sound almost like a legitimate transaction. He introduced himself to nobody in particular and got started without any ceremony. "Healthy girl, 19 years of age, good working condition," he said, in the same tone he might describe a piece of furniture. "Debt of record, lawfully transferred, sale duly authorized." Elara's jaw tightened. She kept her chin up. "Authorized by who?" she said. The auctioneer blinked. A few people in the crowd shifted. "By the holder of the debt," the man said, recovering quickly. Your uncle, miss, has...
My uncle, Alara said, loudly enough that even the people at the back could hear, does not own me. Nobody owns me. And whatever piece of paper he signed, I didn't sign anything. There was a murmur in the crowd. Not the sympathetic kind, more the sound of people recalibrating their expectations of how complicated this was going to get. Boone, at the front, smiled without warmth. Somebody quiet her down, he said, to no one in particular. One of his men took a step forward. Touch me, Alara said, looking directly at him, and I will make sure every person in this town hears exactly what you're doing here today. I will say your name so many times people will be sick of hearing it. The man stopped. He looked at Boone. Boone's smile stayed fixed, but his eyes sharpened slightly, the way a man's eyes do when he's revising his estimate of a problem. Start the bidding, Boone said. The auctioneer cleared his throat and started. What happened over the next 20 minutes was one of the ugliest things Alara Quinn had ever witnessed, and she was at the center of it. Numbers were called out. Men she recognized. Men who'd bought grain from her uncle's store. Men who'd tipped their hats to her on the street. Men who'd done ordinary human things in her presence for years. Stood in the morning light and placed bids on her. Not all of them. Some stood silent with their eyes on their boots. But enough did that she stopped recognizing the faces and started just looking at the sky, focusing on keeping her breathing even and her expression still. She would not cry. That was the one thing she'd decided in those dark early hours before they came for her. She would not give them that. Boone bid last and bid high, significantly higher than anyone else, which told her this had been arranged in advance, that the bidding was a performance for the benefit of the crowd more than a real competition. He'd always been going to win. The question was how much theater his particular vanity required. The auctioneer called the number, looked out at the crowd. Going once. 200. The voice came from the direction of the street, and it was not a voice that needed to raise itself to be heard. It was the kind of voice that had learned through long practice or natural constitution to carry without effort, flat and unhurried, with a quality like a door shutting in a quiet room. Every head in the crowd turned. The man on the horse was not remarkable to look at first. He was broad-shouldered but not enormous, dressed in worn trail clothes the color of dry grass, with a hat pulled low against the sun. He hadn't shaved recently. The horse under him was a dark bay that stood very still, which was either a sign of good training or an animal that had learned to mirror its rider's stillness. What made people step back slightly was not the man's size. It was the way he sat. Not like someone arriving, but like someone who had already assessed the situation and made several decisions about it before anyone else had finished forming their first thought. The 2 guns at his belt were well worn. That too told a story. Rhett Voss, someone near the back of the crowd said quietly, and the name passed through the assembled people like a cold wind through tall grass. Not loud, but felt. Boone turned to look at the newcomer. The warmth left his expression entirely. Voss? He said. Boone. Rhett Voss didn't move from his horse. 200. I said it clearly enough the first time. This isn't your business. The bid makes it my business. There was a silence. The auctioneer looked at Boone. Boone looked at Voss. Voss looked at nothing in particular, or maybe everything. You don't even know what you're bidding on, Boone said. I can see what I'm bidding on, Voss said. $200. Do you want to keep going or not? The auctioneer, to his credit or his spinelessness, did the only thing a man in his position could do. He called the bid. Boone stared at Voss for a long moment. Then, without speaking, he turned and walked to the edge of the crowd and kept walking, and his 2 men followed him, and the space he left behind felt oddly empty, even with 30 other people standing in it. Alara had been watching all of this from the platform. Her wrists were still tied. Her lips still hurt. She didn't know this man, didn't know his name or his reputation, or why he'd done what he'd done, and she was not so naive as to assume that being bought by a stranger with guns on his belt was necessarily better than the alternative. Voss dismounted, handed his reins to a boy nearby without looking at him, climbed the 2 steps to the platform, and stood in front of her. Up close, he was older than she'd thought. Early 30s, maybe, with lines at the corners of his eyes and a jaw that looked like it had met a few hard things. His eyes were a pale, washed-out gray that didn't tell her much. He looked at her rope, then at her face. "You going to fight me?" he asked. Not threatening, genuinely asking. "That depends on what you're planning," Elara said. "I'm planning to cut that rope." He had a knife out before she'd finished processing the sentence, not drawn in any dramatic fashion, just produced, the way a man produces a tool he uses regularly. He cut the rope with one motion, put the knife away, and stepped back. "Now," he said, "you can walk wherever you want. But if you've got any sense, you'll come with me because those men who just left aren't gone. They're just regrouping, and you don't want to still be standing in the middle of this street when they figure out what they want to do next." Elara rubbed her wrists, looked at the crowd, which was dispersing now with the slightly embarrassed speed of people who wanted to be elsewhere. Looked back at the man. "Why?" she said. "Why what? Why did you bid? Why do any of this?" Voss looked at her for a moment with those gray eyes that didn't give much away. "Because someone had to," he said, as if this were a fairly obvious answer, and walked back to his horse. She followed him. Not because she trusted him, she made that clear, to herself and to him, in the first 30 seconds after they left the platform. She followed him because he was right about the street and about Boone's men, and because her alternatives were limited in ways that made her chest tight when she let herself think about them directly. Her mother had been dead for 6 years. Her father had left the territory when she was 12 and hadn't written since. She had $3 sewn into the hem of her dress, and a cousin in a town 2 days' ride east who she'd never met. That was the complete inventory of her resources. Voss's ranch was 4 miles outside of Black Hollow, set back from the main trail along a dry creek bed that had water in it about 3 months out of the year. The house was single-story and not particularly large, built from a combination of timber and stone that spoke more of practical durability than any interest in appearance. There was a barn, a corral with 5 horses in it, and a water pump that worked. There was no garden, no decorative anything, no evidence that anyone had ever tried to make the place look like more than what it was. A working ranch run by a man who lived alone. They didn't talk much on the ride out. Elara spent the time watching him, which she did with the directness of someone who'd decided that observation was a better use of energy than politeness. He rode with the ease of someone who'd spent more time on horseback than off it. He didn't look at her much. When he did, it was the same quality of look, flat and assessing, like he was checking a fact he already knew and confirming it hadn't changed. "You live out here alone?" she asked, about 2 miles in. "Yeah." "For how long?" He thought about it. 3 years. "You always this talkative?" The corner of his mouth moved slightly. It might have been a smile, or it might have been something else. "You want a talker," he said. "You're going to be disappointed. I want to know who I'm dealing with." "Fair enough?" He was quiet for a moment. "Rhett Voss. From Laramie, originally. Came down here 3 years ago. Don't work for anyone in Black Hollow, and don't owe anyone in Black Hollow, which puts me in a smaller category than you'd think." "The reputation," Elara said. "People knew your name. They moved back when you rode in." He didn't answer that directly. "People in this territory have long memories, and they don't always remember things accurately," he said. "I've done things I'm not proud of. I've also done things that weren't what they looked like. I'm not going to try to explain all of it to you in one afternoon." "Are you dangerous?" He looked at her then, properly, for a moment. "Yes," he said, "but not to you." She didn't know if she believed that. She decided to act like she did for now, because the alternative was spending the whole ride in a state of dread that would leave her too tired to think when she needed to think. When they reached the ranch, he showed her the house without ceremony. A main room with a table and 2 chairs and a fireplace. A small kitchen. 2 other rooms, one of which was clearly his, and the other of which contained boxes and equipment and a cot that hadn't been slept on recently. He cleared a space in the second room, brought the cot out into better light, and told her it was hers. "There's a bolt on the inside of the door," he said. "Use it if you want." "I will," she said. He nodded once, like this was entirely sensible, and left her to it. She didn't sleep well, which wasn't surprising. She lay on the cot and listened to the sounds of the ranch at night, the horses moving in the corral, something small rustling in the grass outside, the occasional creak of the house settling in the heat,
and she thought about her uncle. Not with grief exactly. The grief had happened earlier, over years, in small portions, as she'd understood incrementally what kind of man he was. What she felt now was colder and more specific, a desire to understand exactly how this had been arranged, and who else had known about it, and what she could do about any of it. Because she was 19 years old, and she'd been put on a platform and sold to pay a gambling debt, and she was not. She had decided this firmly and with complete conviction, lying on a stranger's cot 4 miles outside a town she no longer felt safe in. She was not going to let that be the end of the story. In the morning, she found Voss in the main room with coffee and a collection of papers spread across the table. He pushed a cup toward her when she came in and didn't make any observations about her appearance, which she appreciated because she'd slept in her clothes and her hair was still half undone from yesterday. "What are all of these?" she asked, looking at the papers. He hesitated for a moment. Not long, just enough for her to notice. "Documents," he said. "About what?" He looked at her. Then, apparently making a decision, he said, "About what's actually happening in Black Hollow." She pulled the other chair out and sat down. "Tell me." "You should eat first." "I'm not hungry. Tell me." He was quiet for a moment, as if deciding where to start. Then he said, "What happened to you yesterday wasn't the first time. It wasn't even the 10th time." She went still. "Black Hollow has been running a trading operation," he said, keeping his voice even, clinical, like he was reading from a report. "Not cattle, not grain, people. Mostly young women, some men, anyone without family connections strong enough to make a fuss. It's been going on for at least 4 years, maybe longer. Boone's at the center of it. The sheriff's in it. The man who runs the land office is in it. The owner of the Copper Bell is in it." He paused. "Your uncle has been feeding them names, people in situations like yours. He wasn't just paying off a debt. He's been a supplier." The room was very quiet. Alara's coffee cup was warm between her hands. She was aware of her own breathing. "How many?" she said. "That I can confirm? 11? That I think is more accurate? Closer to 30. Some of them went east. Some of them went into Mexico. Some of them," he stopped. "Some of them I can't track." "You've been investigating this." 3 years, he said. "Alone." "I've had some help, not much." His jaw was tight. "The problem is evidence. I have records. I have ledgers I copied. I have testimony from 2 people who agreed to talk to me and then left the territory because they were afraid to stay. What I don't have is a way to bring it to anyone with the authority to do something about it, because everyone with authority in Black Hollow is either part of it or afraid of the people who are." Alara looked at the papers on the table. They were covered in figures, names, dates, the careful, methodical work of someone who had been at this for a long time and had learned to document things because documentation was the only weapon he had left. "Why did you bid on me yesterday?" she said. "The real reason." He looked at her for a moment. "Because I was there," he said. "Because I've been watching this happen for 3 years, and I've had to make calculations about timing and evidence and what I can and can't do alone. And yesterday, I was sitting in that crowd and watching you on that platform, and you were looking at those men like you were memorizing their faces, and I thought—" He stopped, started again. "I thought I'd run out of reasons to keep waiting." Alara set her coffee cup down. "What do you need?" she said. "I'm sorry?" "To finish this. To get it to someone who can actually do something. What do you need that you don't have?" He studied her. "It's not safe," he said. "These are not cautious men. What happened to you yesterday, that was already dangerous. If they figure out you're here, if they figure out what I've been doing—" "I heard you," Alara said. "What do you need?" He was quiet for a long time. Outside, one of the horses made a sound and then was still. "There's a ledger," he said finally. "In the land office. Crawley, the man who runs it, he's been recording transactions that aren't on the official books. Property transfers, payments, names. If I could get a copy of it, I could put together a package that any federal marshal with half a brain couldn't ignore. And you can't get it yourself." "Not without Crawley seeing me. He knows my face." Alara thought about this. "He doesn't know mine," she said. "You're not going anywhere near that office." "You're not my employer," she said simply. Not angry, just factual.
You spent $200 yesterday, which I intend to repay you once I figure out how, but that doesn't give you any say over what I do. She paused. And you know I'm right. You've been waiting 3 years for the right piece of evidence.
You said so yourself. You have a way to get it. I'm the way. He looked at her with those gray eyes, and something shifted in them that wasn't quite calculation and wasn't quite resignation, something in between, something that had to do with recognizing a decision he'd already lost the argument about. You'd need a reason to go in, he said slowly. Something that makes sense. I can think of several, she said. Land records are public. Anyone can ask to look at them. Crawley would note who's asking. Then I'd need to be someone he doesn't pay attention to. Someone who doesn't register as a threat. You're not exactly invisible, Voss said. After yesterday, Alara said, the story everyone in that town is going to tell is that Rhett Voss bought a girl at auction and took her out to his ranch. They're going to be waiting to hear what happens next. They're not going to be expecting her to walk into the land office 2 days later asking about property records like she's nobody important. He was quiet. She was right, and he knew it, and she could see him working through the acknowledgement of that fact against every instinct he had that was telling him this was a bad idea. 2 days, he said finally. Give me 2 days to set it up properly. Figure out what you'd be asking for, what Crawley is likely to show you versus what he'd keep back. We go in with a plan. Agreed, she said. He nodded, looked back down at his papers. Then, without looking up, you want to know what I know? Everything I've put together? Yes. He started from the beginning. It took most of the morning. The 2 days he'd asked for turned into a crash education in the geography of corruption. Voss had a system, not elegant, but thorough. He'd organized his documents into groups, financial records, names, dates, properties. He walked her through all of it, and she sat across the table from him for hours and asked questions and made him explain things twice when she didn't understand them and didn't apologize for it. He answered without condescension, which she noted. She was quick. He noticed that early in the first hour, and it recalibrated something in his approach. He stopped simplifying without her asking him to stop, and they covered ground faster. What emerged over the course of those 2 days was a picture of something that had started small and grown through the slow accretion of unchecked power. Boone had begun with straightforward coercion, buying debt, leveraging it, moving people around like chess pieces. The trading of people had grown out of that organically, grotesquely, as he'd found buyers and discovered there was money in it. The town's official apparatus had been absorbed piece by piece, the sheriff, the land office, the single judge who passed through the circuit court. People who raised questions disappeared or left or were quietly ruined until they stopped raising questions. Voss had been brought to Black Hollow originally by a man named Cutter, who'd been trying to document the operation from inside and needed a partner with certain skills. Cutter had been killed 8 months after Voss arrived. Voss had stayed because leaving felt like losing, and because he'd already spent too long on this to walk away clean. You could have left, Alara said, on the second evening. Could have, he agreed. Why didn't you? He was quiet for a moment, looking at the table. Cutter had a daughter, he said. Back in Kansas somewhere. He told me about her once. She was 9. He paused. I don't know why that particular thing stuck. A lot of people got hurt in the middle of all this. But I kept thinking, someone ought to do something about this before she's old enough to end up in a situation like the ones in these ledgers. He shrugged, slightly uncomfortable, the way people get when they've said something true and personal and would like to move on from it. It's not a particularly logical reason. It's a perfectly logical reason, Alara said. He looked at her. It's not abstract, she said. Abstract things are easy to set aside when it gets hard. You made it specific. He didn't say anything to that. After a moment, he looked back down at his papers. That night, lying on her cot, Alara thought about 11 confirmed people and 30 probable people, and the specific quality of her uncle's expression when they'd taken her away. Not quite guilty. Not quite anything, like a man who'd already done the accounting and moved on. She thought about the women in the back of the crowd who hadn't done anything but hadn't been able to quite look away either. She thought about what Voss had said. Someone,
ought to do something. In the morning, she was ready.
Black Hollow looked different when you entered it with a purpose. She rode in on one of Voss's horses, a calm roan that didn't draw attention, wearing a dress she'd found in one of the boxes in her room. It had belonged to someone else once and had been left behind, and she didn't ask about that. It was plain and fit her well enough. She'd pinned her hair up properly and washed her face and done the small things that turned a person from a spectacle into a background detail. The main street was mid-morning busy. She recognized some of the faces from the auction and made herself not look at them differently than anyone else. She was nobody. She was running an errand. She had no particular relationship to the events of 2 days ago. The land office was between the post building and a dry goods store, marked with a small sign that had faded to nearly nothing in the sun. She pushed the door open. The man behind the counter was thin and pale in a way that suggested he spent most of his time indoors, with round spectacles and ink-stained fingers and the particular wariness of a person who was guilty of something and had gotten used to watching doorways. This was Crawley. He looked at her. She watched his face for recognition and didn't see it. "Good. Help you?" he said. "I hope so," Alara said, and she made her voice light and a little uncertain, the kind of voice that reads as harmless. "My family is looking at purchasing some land in this area, and my father asked me to come in and look at the property records for the eastern parcels. He's considering a few different lots and wants to know the recorded owners before we commit to approaching anyone." Crawley's expression shifted through a few things quickly. The standard merchant's assessment of a potential customer, a flicker of something more calculating, and then a settling into what seemed like routine. An inquiry about property records was the kind of thing that happened. It was not unusual. "Which parcels?" he said. "The ones along the creek tributary east of the main trail," she said. "There are 4 or 5 of them, I think, that have changed hands in the last few years." He was already moving toward the filing cabinets behind him. She watched his hands, his movements, the way his eyes tracked across the files. She noted which drawer he pulled from, how the files were organized, what he took out, and what he left in place. He put 3 folders on the counter. She spent 20 minutes looking through them, carefully, asking occasional questions that were just coherent enough to sound like genuine inquiry and just vague enough to require him to explain things. While he talked, she memorized what she could and noted what she couldn't. The main ledger, the one Voss had described, was in the bottom drawer on the right. She was almost certain of it. He touched that drawer twice and then stopped himself, like a person with a nervous habit they're suppressing. She thanked him, told him her father would be in touch, and left. 4 miles out, she told Voss everything she'd seen. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The bottom right drawer." "Yes, that's the one." He nodded slowly. "All right." His jaw was tight. "We need one more thing. We need someone to actually witness what's in it. The copies I make, I can't be the one to produce them in front of a marshal. I'm not a disinterested party. We need someone from outside Black Hollow, someone with standing." "There must be people in the neighboring settlements who've lost someone," Alara said. "There are." He paused. "I've been careful not to contact them. If I did, Boone's people would notice the conversations, and it would tip them off." "But I could," Alara said. He looked at her. "I'm already here," she said. "I'm already involved, and they don't know what I know." She kept her voice steady. "Tell me who to talk to." He said nothing for a long moment. He was doing the same calculation he'd been doing for 3 years. What was worth the risk and what wasn't, where the line was between necessary and reckless. She could see it on his face. It wasn't comfortable for him, that calculation, which maybe meant he still had enough conscience that it cost him something. "There's a family in Sorrow Creek," he said finally, 12 miles north, a woman named Nora Hatch. She had a sister who went missing 2 years ago. She's been quiet about it. She's not stupid, but she knows what happened. She's been waiting for someone to give her a reason to talk. "Then that's where I'll go tomorrow," Alara said. Outside, the late afternoon light was long and orange across the dry grass. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cut a circle against the sky. Alara Quinn was 19 years old, and she'd been tied to a post in the town square and sold to the highest bidder 3 days ago. And now she was sitting at a table covered in evidence of crimes that had swallowed 30 lives and possibly more, planning the next step in a campaign against the most powerful man in the valley. She was also tired and her knuckles still ached, and she hadn't had a decent meal in 3 days. "Is there anything to eat?" she asked. Voss blinked. Then something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. "Beans," he said, "and hardtack." "That's terrible. I don't get a lot of guests." "That," Alara said, pulling her chair back and standing up, "is something we're going to need to address." She went and found the beans herself. It was not a perfect evening, but it was hers, which was more than it had been 3 days ago, and that, for now, was enough. Sorrow Creek was not much of a town. It was more of an arrangement, a cluster of buildings that had arrived at the same location through separate decisions and stayed because moving was expensive. There was a general store, a blacksmith, a small post office, and maybe 40 families spread across the surrounding farmland, people who'd come out here with plans and learned to revise them significantly. Alara made the ride in the early morning, before the heat got serious, along a trail that was more suggestion than road. She'd borrowed Voss's better map and memorized it the night before, and still took one wrong turn about 7 miles in, which cost her half an hour and added a particular flavor of irritation to what was already a nerve-strung morning. She found the Hatch property through the description Voss had given her. A low stone fence on the east side, a pair of cottonwood trees that had grown together at an angle, a red barn that had lost most of its red to weathering. The farmhouse itself was small and kept up with the slightly fierce tidiness of someone who'd decided that the condition of the property was one of the few things they still controlled. A woman came out of the house before Alara had finished dismounting. She was in her mid-30s, with the kind of face that had been pretty once and was now something better, harder and more specific, with dark eyes that made an assessment and completed it before Alara had said a word. "I don't know you," the woman said. "No," Alara agreed. "My name's Alara Quinn. I came from Black Hollow." Something changed in the woman's posture, a slight drawing in, like a person bracing. "What for?" "I'm looking for Nora Hatch." "You found her." She didn't move from her position near the door. "What do you want from Black Hollow?" "I want to talk to you about your sister," Alara said. The silence that followed was not empty. It was packed with things, with grief and old anger and the particular wariness of a woman who'd learned that talking about certain subjects had consequences in this part of the territory. Nora Hatch looked at her for a long moment, measuring something. "Come inside," she said finally. "Leave the horse at the post." The inside of the house was neat in the same deliberate way the outside was neat, with a kitchen table that took up most of the main room and a window that looked out over a garden that was doing better than most things at this latitude had any right to. Nora Hatch put water on to heat without asking if Alara wanted any and sat down across from her with her hands flat on the table. "How did you know about Mara?" she said. "I've been working with someone who's been documenting what's been happening out of Black Hollow for 3 years, Alara said. Her name came up in the records. Nora's jaw tightened. "Working with who?" "A man named Rhett Voss." The name landed differently here than it had in Black Hollow. Not with fear, with something more complicated. Recognition and maybe cautious respect, or the memory of it. "I know that name," Nora said slowly. "He came to see me 2 years ago, right after Mara disappeared. Asked some questions. I didn't talk to him." "Why not?" "Because I had 2 children and a farm and no protection," Nora said, with a flatness that wasn't coldness. It was just the sound of a decision that had cost something. "Because I'd already asked around enough to know what kind of men were involved. And I knew what happened to people who made themselves inconvenient. Voss was one man with a gun and a lot of questions, and I didn't see how talking to him kept my children safe." "That's a reasonable calculation," Alara said. Nora looked at her. "What changed?" "The evidence is closer to complete than it's ever been. There's a ledger in the Black Hollow Land Office that ties the transactions together. The properties, the payments, the names. If we can get eyes on it from someone with standing outside Black Hollow, we have something a federal marshal can't dismiss." "We." Nora said it with a slight emphasis. "You said we." "Yes." "You're 19 years old,"
Nora said. I'm guessing from the way you look that whatever happened to bring you into this wasn't your idea. It wasn't, Alara said. My uncle sold me at auction 4 days ago. Voss bought me out of it. Now I'm here. Nora was quiet. She looked at the table, then out the window, then back at Alara, and there was something moving across her face that was difficult to name. Not pity, not quite admiration, something more raw than either of those things. They put you on the platform, she said. Yes. In the middle of town. Yes. And you're sitting here talking to me about ledgers and marshals. Nora shook her head, not in disbelief, but in some private reckoning. My sister wouldn't have done that, she said quietly. Mara would have run as far as she could get and never looked back. She was the sensible one. A pause. I was always the stubborn one. Then you understand the impulse, Alara said. Nora's eyes came back to her, sharp and tired and alive with something that had been waiting for a while to find somewhere to go. What do you need from me? Your testimony. What Mara told you before she disappeared, what you saw, what you know.
If we get the ledger, your account connects it to real people and real harm. Without someone like you, it's just numbers on paper. And you think a federal marshal will actually do something? I think if we give them enough, they won't have a choice, Alara said. The men running this operation aren't being careful anymore. They've been doing it too long, and it's worked too well, and they've gotten comfortable. Comfortable people make mistakes. Nora looked at her for a long time. Then she stood up, went to the stove, poured 2 cups of water that wasn't quite hot enough yet, and brought them back to the table anyway. Tell me about this ledger, she said. They talked for 2 hours. What Nora Hatch knew was more than Voss had expected. She'd been quiet, but not passive. And in the 2 years since her sister's disappearance, she'd done her own quiet gathering of information, the kind that didn't advertise itself. She knew names, she knew dates. She knew about a man in the neighboring settlement of Reed Flat who'd had a daughter go missing and had taken money to stop asking questions, which was its own kind of evidence about who had money to spend on silence. By the time Alara rode back out onto the trail, she had 3 pages of notes written on the back of a store receipt she'd found in her coat pocket, and Nora Hatch had agreed to make the ride to Black Hollow when the time came. It was progress. It was also the kind of progress that made Alara aware, with new clarity, of how much could still go wrong. She was a mile from the ranch when she saw the smoke. Not a lot of it, just a thin column rising from somewhere near the eastern edge of Voss's property. The kind of fire that wasn't an accident and wasn't quite a threat yet, but was meant to be noticed. She pushed the roan to a faster pace and came over the low rise at the edge of the creek bed to find Voss standing in his yard with his arms at his sides and 3 men on horseback facing him. She pulled up at a distance that she hoped was far enough to think for a moment. One of the 3 men was someone she recognized, the taller of Boone's 2 men from the auction. He was doing the talking, which meant he was the one she needed to listen to. Just a conversation, he was saying, as she brought the horse close enough to hear. Mr. Boone wants to know if you've had time to reconsider the situation. I don't have anything to reconsider, Voss said. His voice was the same as always, flat and unhurried, which under the current circumstances Alara recognized as a deliberate choice rather than a natural state. You spent $200 on something that doesn't belong to you, the tall man said. Mr. Boone's of the opinion that there may have been some confusion about the nature of the transaction. There wasn't any confusion, Voss said. I placed a bid. It was accepted. That's the nature of an auction. The item in question, the man said, with a care in his phrasing that was itself a small act of ugliness, had an existing arrangement that predated the sale. Mr. Boone feels the sale may not have been entirely valid. Then Mr. Boone can take it up with the auctioneer, Voss said, who took his money and ran last I checked, so good luck with that. Alara had been sitting on the roan watching this exchange and making calculations of her own. 3 men. Voss was armed, she could see that. The fire she'd seen was behind the barn. Something small, not structural, just enough to require attention and split focus. Distraction, not destruction. They weren't here to burn the place down, they were here to deliver a message. She rode forward into the yard. All 3 men turned to look at her. The tall one's expression shifted through a few things. Surprise, recognition, and then something more calculating as he revised his picture of the situation. Miss Quinn, he said. I don't know your name, she said pleasantly. What is it? The question caught him slightly off balance. Webb, he said, apparently before he'd decided to. Webb, she repeated. That's helpful. I like to know the names of men who visit. She stopped her horse alongside Voss's position and looked at the three men evenly. What's burning behind the barn? Just some brush, Webb said. Got out of hand. Accidentally. That's right. In August, she said, when everything's dry. Webb looked at her with the particular expression of a man who's used to women being an inconvenience rather than an obstacle and is in the process of revising his categories. You're being very casual, he said, for someone in your position. What position is that? Someone who was in a fair amount of trouble 4 days ago, he said. Someone who might find herself in a similar situation again, depending on how this conversation goes. Alara looked at him steadily. You just threatened me in front of 2 witnesses, she said. Thank you, that's useful. Webb stared at her. I'd like you to leave now, she said. And tell Mr. Boone that if he has something to say, he's welcome to come say it himself instead of sending people to set fires on private property. It was, she was aware, a reckless thing to say. It was the kind of thing that made situations like this one tip in unpredictable directions. She could feel Voss go very still beside her, not from fear, but from the alertness of a man who had suddenly shifted from managing a conversation to being ready for whatever came after it. Webb looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Voss. Then he looked back at his 2 companions, and some silent communication passed between them, and he turned his horse. Mr. Boone, he said, appreciates the response. He said it in the way people say things when they mean the opposite. We'll be in touch. They rode out. Alara and Voss watched them go without moving. When the sound of hooves had faded to nothing, Voss exhaled. Not loudly, but she heard it. The fire, she said. I'll get it, he said, and walked toward the barn. She followed. The fire was in a pile of old lumber stacked against the east fence, burning steadily, but not wildly, containable with the water from the pump if they moved fast. They moved fast. Neither of them spoke while they were working. It was the kind of task that absorbed language and used it as fuel. And anyway, there was something almost focused about it. The 2 of them moving in the same efficient rhythm, hauling water and smothering and hauling water again until the smoke was just smoke and the lumber was a black mess against the fence. Voss looked at the damage. Waste of good wood, he said. We need to move faster, Alara said. He looked at her. They know you have me here, she said. Whatever calculation they were making before, whether to leave you alone, whether you were a manageable problem, that's changed. You bidding at the auction made you visible. Now they're watching, and it won't take them long to start wondering why. I know, he said. How long to copy what you need from the ledger? If I can get into the office and have time to work, 2 hours, maybe 3. Crawley locks up at 6, Alara said. I noticed the sign in the window. He goes to the copper bell after. There's a back window on the south side that has a latch that doesn't sit flush. I saw it from the alley when I was coming out. Voss looked at her with a quality of attention she was starting to recognize. The particular kind he deployed when someone said something that changed his estimate of a situation. You noticed all of that. I noticed things, she said simply. It wasn't arrogance, just fact. She'd been noticing things her whole life, cataloging details the way other people collect objects, because information had always been the only resource she had that nobody could take away without her cooperation. If I go in after hours and Crawley comes back, I'll be watching the copper bell, she said. If he leaves early, you'll know. How will I know? She thought about it. I'll ride past the office once, just once, at an ordinary pace. That's the signal. That's not a very sophisticated system, he said. No, she agreed. But it's simple, which means it's hard to misread. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the burned lumber. Tonight's too soon, he said. We need 1 more day. I need to get word to a man in the next county, a land surveyor named Aldred, who's honest and has professional standing and can serve as a witness to copied documents. Without him, the copies are just copies. Send the message today, she said. Can he be here by tomorrow night? If he rides hard, then tell him to ride hard. Voss looked at her. There was something in his expression that wasn't quite what she'd describe as warmth. It was more complicated than warmth, more aware of complications and costs. But it wasn't cold either. It was the expression of someone who had been operating alone for a long time and was in the process of adjusting to something different, something that required trust, which was a currency he'd long since stopped spending freely. "You handled Webb well," he said. "Back there." "I made him angry," she said. "That's not always the same as handling something well." "In this case it was," he said. "Men like Webb, when they're deciding whether to do something violent, they need a story they can tell themselves. You being frightened would have given him one. You being calm and naming things out loud takes it away. He came here to intimidate. He left without having done it." He paused. "That cost Boone something. Not much, but something." She thought about that. "You think like a tactician," she said. "I've had to," he said. He didn't say it with any particular pride. It was the same tone as everything else he said. Level, with the occasional texture of something underneath it that he wasn't making a production of. She watched him turn back toward the house, and she thought about what Nora Hatch had said. The stubborn one. Alara had never thought of herself in those terms exactly, but standing in the yard of a stranger's ranch with smoke in the air and 200 miles of hostile territory in every direction, she thought maybe stubbornness was underrated as a survival strategy. That evening, Voss wrote a letter to Aldred and wrote it to the post himself, which meant he was gone for 2 hours, and Alara used the time to do something she'd been putting off. She went through the rest of the documents on the table, the ones he hadn't walked her through yet, and read them herself, carefully, making her own notes in the margins of a piece of paper she found in the kitchen drawer. Some of it was worse than she'd expected. Not surprising. She'd long since stopped expecting the world to match the scale of what she could imagine, but worse. The scope of it, the duration, the number of names and dates and transaction records that told the story of 30 people whose lives had been bought and sold and moved across the frontier like cargo. One of the names was a girl from Black Hollow she'd known. Not well. They'd spoken maybe a dozen times, in the way people who live in the same small place speak to each other without quite becoming friends. Her name was written in Crawley's ledger notation, alongside a date and a payment amount, and a destination that had no further record. Alara sat with that for a while. She didn't cry. She thought about it. Whether she should, whether there was something wrong with the fact that she didn't, whether the dry, cold clarity in her chest was a reasonable response, or evidence of something damaged in her. She decided it didn't matter right now. There would be time later to feel things properly. Right now, she had work to do. When Voss came back, she had 3 pages of organized notes that cross-referenced his records with what Nora Hatch had told her, and identified 6 specific documents in his collection that, paired with the ledger, would form the core of a case she could explain clearly to a federal marshal in under 20 minutes. He stood in the doorway and looked at the table. "You reorganized everything," he said. "I made copies of the key sections," she said, "in my handwriting. So we have 2 sets, and I cross-referenced Nora Hatch's account with your transaction records. There are 4 overlap points that are very specific, dates and amounts, and a description of a man she saw at her sister's house 2 days before Mara disappeared, who matches the description of Webb." He was very still. "Webb," he said. "Yes, he's not just Boone's errand man. He's been directly involved from the beginning." She looked at her notes. "Which means today at the ranch, that wasn't just intimidation. That was personal. He was there to see what we had." Voss sat down across from her slowly. He looked at the reorganized documents, at her handwriting in the margins, at the cross-referenced notes she'd made, and something moved across his face that she didn't quite have a name for. 3 years, he said quietly. "What?" 3 years I've been building this, he said, "and in 4 days you found 2 connections I didn't have." He wasn't saying it with anything that needed to be celebrated. He was saying it the way you say a fact that reorients something. "I had help," she said. "You built the foundation. I'm just reading it." He shook his head slowly, not in disagreement exactly, but with the expression of a man updating his map. Outside, the wind had picked up, and somewhere in the distance across the dark valley floor, the lights of Black Hollow glowed faint and steady. A town that had looked the other way for 4 years, that had stood in the morning sun and let a 19-year-old girl be sold on its main street and then gone back to its ordinary business. Alara looked at those lights for a moment. Then she looked back at her notes, picked up her pencil, and kept working. Aldred arrived the following evening, just before dark, on a horse that looked like it had strong opinions about the pace it had been asked to maintain. He was a compact man in his 50s with a surveyor's squint and hands that were permanently ink-stained in a different way than Crawley's. Crawley's were the stains of a man who handled paper carefully. Aldred's were the stains of someone who worked outdoors and brought the documentation with him rather than the other way around. He shook Voss's hand and looked at Alara with the frank curiosity of someone who hadn't been told much and was filling in the gaps on his own. "You're the girl from the auction," he said. "That's one way to describe me," Alara said. He nodded, apparently satisfied with that exchange, and sat down at the table and asked to see what they had. He spent 40 minutes going through the documents without speaking. Occasionally he picked something up and held it closer to the lamp. Once he made a short sound that wasn't quite a word. When he finished, he set the last page down and looked at Voss. "This is enough," he said. "Not comfortable enough, but enough." "Comfortable enough for what?" Alara asked. "For a federal marshal to open an inquiry without immediately worrying about his career," Aldred said. He had the direct, slightly blunt manner of a man who'd spent his professional life dealing in facts and had limited patience for ornament. "What you have here is a pattern. Patterns aren't proof, but paired with physical evidence from the ledger and a credible witness account, a pattern becomes a case." He looked at Voss. "You've been sitting on this for 3 years." "I needed the ledger," Voss said. "You needed more than that, and you know it," Aldred said, not unkindly. "You needed someone to help you see what you had." Voss didn't answer that. Alara didn't look at him. "When do we go in?" Aldred asked. "Tomorrow night," Voss said. "Crawley goes to the Copper Bell at 6 and stays until 8, sometimes later. That gives us a window." "You're sure about the latch on the south window?" "I'm sure," Alara said. Aldred looked at her again with that frank assessment. "You've been inside the office?" "Yes." "And Crawley didn't think twice about you?" "No." He nodded slowly. "Then tomorrow," he said, and reached for the coffee that nobody had offered him yet, found the pot on the stove himself, and poured a cup with the ease of a man who'd long since stopped waiting to be served. That night, Alara lay on her cot and ran the plan through her head the way you'd run your hands over a rope bridge before crossing it, looking for the weak points, the places where the boards were thin or the knots weren't quite right. There were several. There were always several. The question was whether the weak points were the kind that could be managed or the kind that would give way without warning. She thought about Webb's face in the yard, the way he'd looked at her, not with the leering assessment of the men at the auction, but with something more dangerous. Recalibration. He was smart enough to recognize that she wasn't frightened and smart enough to understand that this was a problem. She thought about Boone, who she'd still only seen that once, standing at the front of the auction crowd with his silver mustache and his good coat and his absolute certainty that the world was organized in a way that served him. Men like Boone were dangerous not because they were violent, though they were, or they had people who were violent on their behalf, but because they had spent so long operating without consequences that they genuinely stopped imagining them. That kind of certainty made them bold. It also made them occasionally careless. She was counting on the careless part. The following day passed in a state of compressed, organized tension. Voss went over the plan 3 times, which Alara understood was not anxiety, but the habit of a man who'd survived long enough to know that plans failed in proportion to how many assumptions they required. Aldred spent the morning making his own copies of the existing documents in a careful, practiced hand, because he believed in redundancy the way other men believed in luck. At 4 in the afternoon, Alara rode into Black Hollow alone. This was not part of the plan. She made that clear to herself as she rode. This was supplementary, an addition she'd decided on the night before and hadn't mentioned to Voss because she'd known what he would say and didn't particularly want to have that argument. What she was doing was not reckless. It was reconnaissance of a specific and necessary kind. She went to the Copper Bell. The saloon at 4 in the afternoon was not the same place it was at night. It had a different texture, quieter, with the slightly stale quality of a room that had been loud recently and was resting. 3 men at a table in the corner, playing cards without much enthusiasm. A bartender wiping glasses. A woman sweeping near the far wall who glanced at Alara and then went back to sweeping without comment. Alara sat at the bar and asked for water, which earned her a look but produced a glass. She sat with it and watched the room in the mirror behind the bar, which was cracked on one side but still serviceable. She was there for 12 minutes before the door opened and Crawley came in. He wasn't supposed to be here until 6. It was barely past 4. She kept her eyes on the mirror and her posture easy and her hands around the glass. Crawley went to the far end of the bar and spoke to the bartender in a low voice. The bartender nodded, produced a key from somewhere under the counter, and handed it over. Crawley pocketed it and left without ordering anything. A key. He'd come in to pick up a key. Alara finished her water and left 2 minutes after him, at a pace that was unhurried enough to be invisible. She found Crawley on the street, half a block ahead, walking in the direction of the land office. She stayed well back and watched him go inside. Through the office window, she could see him moving around, pulling files, checking something in the back. He was in there for 20 minutes, then came out, locked the door, and walked back toward the Copper Bell, this time from the south side, which meant he went past the alley along the back of the building. Alara stood at the edge of the alley and watched him pause at the south side of the land office, check something on the back wall. The window, she realized. He checked the window latch. Then he walked on. She stood very still for a moment after he was gone. He knew about the window. Not just knew, he'd checked it, which meant either someone had told him it was compromised, or he checked it routinely, which implied he'd had reason to worry about it before. Either way, the south window was no longer viable, and Voss and Aldred were planning to be there in 2 hours. She rode hard back to the ranch. Voss heard her out without interrupting, which she'd learned was his way. He didn't interject while someone was giving him information because he was actually listening rather than waiting for a gap to speak. He checked the latch, he said, when she finished. Yes. Then he either reinforced it or he's planning to be inside when we arrive. He was quiet for a moment. Or both. Aldred, who had been listening from across the table, said, "Is there another way in?" "Front door," Voss said. "Lock is standard. Nothing unusual. But it faces the main street." "At night the main street is quiet," Alara said. "If we go late enough, past 9, the Copper Bell crowd will be inside and the street will be empty. If Crawley's inside the office waiting, then we need to know whether he's actually there," she said, "before we touch the door." They looked at each other. "I can find out," she said. "No," Voss said. "I can walk past the office window," she said. "On the street side, I can look in. If there's a lamp on inside, he's there. If it's dark, it's empty. That's all. And if he's there and he sees you through the window, he has no reason to think I know anything," she said. "He thinks I'm a girl Voss bought at an auction. People in Black Hollow are expecting me to either run or stay quiet. Walking past the land office on a Thursday night is not a suspicious thing." "You're very good at making dangerous things sound ordinary," Voss said. "One of us has to be," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Aldred was very carefully not contributing to this exchange, studying his copies with the focused attention of a man who understood when a conversation wasn't his. "If the light is on," Voss said finally, "you walk past and you keep walking. You don't stop. You don't look in for more than a second. You come back here." "Agreed. And if the light is off, you come back here. You don't wait. You don't go near the door. You don't do anything except ride back." "I understand." "I need you to actually mean that," he said. "Not just say it." She met his eyes. "I mean it." The 3 of them went into Black Hollow separately, which had been the plan regardless. Aldred first on the pretext of nothing, just a traveler passing through who needed to water his horse and happened to stop. Voss 20 minutes later, coming in from the north side, staying off the main street. Alara last from the south at 8:30 when the sky was properly dark and the Copper Bell was lit up and audible from 2 blocks away. She rode the main street slowly. The land office was dark. She looked for half a second, enough to be certain, and kept riding. At the end of the block, she turned and doubled back on the parallel street,
dismounted and tied her horse to a post outside a dry goods store that had been closed for hours. She found Voss in the alley off the main street at the prearranged point. Aldred was already with him. "Dark," she said. Voss nodded. "Front door. Quick." The lock took him about 4 minutes, which was longer than she'd hoped and shorter than she'd feared. Aldred watched the street. Alara watched both of them and the windows of the buildings across the way and the mouth of the alley and the patch of light spilling from the copper bell 2 blocks north. The lock gave. They went in. Inside the land office in the dark was a different experience than inside the land office in the daytime.
The same room, the same furniture, the same smell of paper and dust and old ink, but stripped of the context of ordinary business, it felt more like what it was, a place where documents had been used as weapons for years. Voss went directly to the back, moving without hesitation, familiar with the general layout from whatever surveillance he'd done before. Aldred followed him. Alara stayed near the front window and watched the street. She heard the sound of a file drawer opening, then another, then Voss's voice, very low. "Got it." The next 40 minutes were the longest of her life, or close to it. She stood near the window and watched the street and listened to the sounds of Voss and Aldred working, the quiet, careful sounds of men copying documents by the light of a single shielded lamp, turning pages slowly, writing in steady, careful hands, not rushing, because rushing caused mistakes, and mistakes were not something they could afford. Twice she heard footsteps on the street outside and held her breath until they passed. Once a dog began barking somewhere nearby and didn't stop for 3 minutes, which felt like a much longer period of time. At 9:47, she knew the time because she'd been marking it in her head, counting intervals the way her mother had taught her to count measures in music, steadily and without rushing. Voss appeared at her shoulder. "Done," he said. They went out the way they'd come in. Voss relocked the door. Aldred had the copied documents inside his coat. They separated at the alley mouth without speaking and left town by 3 different routes. She was a mile out of Black Hollow, riding in the dark, when the shaking started. Not visible shaking. Her hands were steady on the reins and the roan moved calmly under her. But something internal, some system that had been held at tension for hours, began to release in a way that wasn't entirely comfortable. She breathed through it, counted the sounds of the horse's hooves on the trail, felt the night air, which had cooled significantly and smelled of dry grass and distant rain. She made it back to the ranch, stabled the horse, and went inside to find Voss already there, sitting at the table with a cup of something hot, looking at the wall with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not satisfaction, something more complicated. The face of a man standing at a point he'd been walking toward for 3 years, and finding it looks different up close. "Aldred has the copies," he said without turning around. "I know. He'll take them to his office in Millhaven. I have keys to get there. When we're ready to move, we go to Millhaven, pick up the full package, and take it to the federal office in Calder." He paused. 4 days, 5 at most." "That's a long time," she said. "Yes." She sat down across from him. The lamp between them made a small, warm radius, and outside the windows the territory was completely dark and completely silent in the way that only empty land at midnight can be. "Boone will know something is wrong," she said. "Webb will have reported back. They'll know we didn't run. They'll start putting things together." "I know," Voss said. "If they move first—" "I know," he said again. He looked at her. "I've been thinking about that." "And?" He was quiet for a moment. "We've been assuming we have to be the ones to reach the marshal. Get to Calder, present the evidence, wait for an official response." He turned his cup in his hand slowly. "But what if there's a faster way to take their power away? Not through an office, through people." She looked at him. "Nora Hatch said there's a man in Reed Flat whose daughter went missing," he said. "There are families in Sorrow Creek. There are people in every settlement within 30 miles who have a reason to want this finished and who've been waiting for someone to show them it's possible." He leaned forward slightly. "If we call a meeting, not in Black Hollow, somewhere neutral, Sorrow Creek maybe, and we show people what we have, not just Aldred, not just Nora, all of them, everyone who has a stake in this, we let them see it together.
That's a lot of people to trust, Alara said. It's also a lot of people Boone can't buy or scare all at once, he said. Right now he moves one person at a time. That's how he's kept control. Isolation. His jaw was tight. You break isolation by putting people in the same room. She thought about it. The logic was sound. It was also a significant acceleration of everything, a step that once taken couldn't be untaken. They'd be visible, explicitly, deliberately visible. If we call that meeting, she said slowly, we need to be ready for what comes after it. Yes. Boone will hear about it, within hours. Yes. And he'll move against us before any marshal has time to arrive. Probably. He looked at her steadily. Which means we need the meeting and the message to Calder to happen at the same time. One move, not sequential. She was quiet for a moment, working through the shape of it. It was bold in a way that was either very smart or very foolish, and the line between those two things in the current situation was narrow enough to make her uncomfortable. You said you've been waiting 3 years for the right moment, she said. I have. Is this it? He looked at her for a long time. I don't know, he said, which was, she'd come to understand, his version of honesty. He didn't dress up uncertainty and confidence he didn't have. But I think waiting longer makes it worse, not better. She looked at the dark windows. Somewhere out across that dark, in a house on the main street of Black Hollow, Cassidy Boone was probably asleep, and Webb was probably awake, running the same calculation she was running, assessing what they knew and what they suspected and what it meant for what came next. Send word to Nora Hatch, she said, and to the man in Reed Flat. Tell them we need 4 days to prepare. Tell them to come ready to talk. She looked back at Voss. And tell Aldred to ride to Calder himself today with the copies. Don't wait for us to bring the full package. Send what we have now. Voss was still. Split the risk, she said. The evidence goes one direction. We go another. Even if Boone moves against us, the documentation is already moving toward a federal office. He stared at her. And then he did something she hadn't seen him do before. He exhaled slowly, completely, like a man putting down something heavy. Yeah, he said quietly. Okay. It wasn't much. But from Rhett Voss at 11 o'clock at night, sitting across a table covered in 3 years of careful, costly, lonely work, it was enough. She went to her room and she bolted the door, and she sat on the cot in the dark and let herself feel frightened for a few minutes, which she'd been postponing for days. Then she lay down, pulled the blanket up, and went to sleep, because tomorrow was going to require everything she had, and she couldn't afford to spend it lying awake. Aldred left for Calder before sunrise, with the copied documents distributed across 3 separate places on his person. Inside his coat, in his saddlebag under a false bottom he'd constructed from a piece of oilskin, and the most critical pages folded into the lining of his boot. He'd thought of the boot himself, which told Alara something about the man's history, with situations where losing documents could be a permanent problem. He shook hands with Voss in the dark yard and looked at Alara. 4 days, he said. Maybe 5 if the road through the pass is bad, but I'll get there. We know, she said. He rode out without ceremony. The sound of his horse faded quickly into the pre-dawn silence, and then there was just the two of them, and the dark, and the work that remained. Voss sent word to Nora Hatch that morning through a boy from a neighboring farm who ran occasional errands without asking too many questions about them. The message was brief. A time, a location, a single line about bringing anyone she trusted who had a reason to attend. He sent a separate message to Reed Flat, to the man whose daughter had gone missing, a farmer named Goss, who Voss had never met directly, but who Nora had confirmed was still in the territory and still angry in the specific, sustained way of someone who'd had nowhere useful to point that anger. The meeting was set for Sorrow Creek in the community building behind the general store, 3 days out. 3 days felt like a long time, and no time at all simultaneously. On the first day, nothing happened, which was its own kind of information. Boone's silence wasn't reassuring. It was the silence of a man who was thinking rather than reacting, which was in some ways more dangerous than immediate aggression. Webb didn't appear. No one came to the ranch.
The main trail that ran past the property was empty of everything except a mule team heading east and a family with a loaded wagon going the other way. Voss spent the day checking his weapons and his stores and making the kind of quiet preparations that didn't announce themselves. Alara spent it reading through the cross-reference documents one more time because she'd be doing the talking at the meeting in Sorrow Creek, and she wanted to know the material the way she knew her own hands, without having to look. On the second day, she rode back to Black Hollow. Voss had argued against this with more force than he'd argued against anything so far. Not loudly, but with a directness that made clear he wasn't raising the objection as a formality. "You don't need to go back in there," he said. "I need to know what they know," she said. "If Boone is planning something, people are talking. People always talk. I can walk into the dry goods store and spend 20 minutes buying flour and hear more about the current state of things than we'll get from sitting out here waiting. And if Webb sees you, Webb seeing me in the dry goods store doesn't give him anything," she said. "I'm a girl from an auction. I'm buying supplies. There's nothing to see." He looked at her with the expression she'd learned meant he'd already run the argument and reached the same conclusion she had, and was unhappy about it. "An hour," he said. "In and out." "An hour," she agreed. Black Hollow on a Wednesday morning looked exactly like itself. Dust and commerce, and the ordinary machinery of a frontier town operating under the assumption that its foundations were solid. She tied her horse outside the dry goods store and went in and bought flour and a length of cotton cloth and a small tin of coffee that they actually needed. And she listened. The dry goods store was run by a woman named Petrie, wide and observant, who kept the store and kept her mouth shut, and consequently knew more about the town than anyone else in it. She looked at Alara over the counter when she came in with the look of a woman doing a rapid internal calculation. "You're Voss's girl," she said. "I'm nobody's girl," Alara said pleasantly. "But I'm staying at his ranch temporarily, yes." Petrie looked at her for another moment, then began pulling the flour from the shelf behind her. "Heard there's a meeting," she said. Her voice was flat, informational. "People coming in from Sorrow Creek direction, some from Reed Flat." Alara went still in a way she hoped didn't show. "Is that right?" "Word gets around," Petrie said. She set the flour on the counter. "Also heard that Boone's been having a lot of private conversations this week. Him and the sheriff and a few others." She paused, weighing something. "Sheriff's been deputizing men. Unofficial. Not the kind of deputies you'd put on a poster." Alara paid for the flour and the cloth and the coffee without any change in her expression. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," Petrie said, and went back to her shelves before Alara had reached the door. She rode back hard. Voss listened to what Petrie had said and what she'd implied, and then was quiet for a while in the particular way that meant he was restructuring something in his thinking. "He knows about the meeting," Voss said. "He knows there's something happening. He may not know the specifics yet. He knows enough." He stood up and went to the window, which wasn't a habit of his. He'd told her early on that standing at windows was a way to make yourself visible and predictable simultaneously, neither of which he recommended. The fact that he did it now told her something about where his head was. "If he's deputizing men, he's not planning to arrest us. He doesn't care about the law here. He's planning to move on the ranch before the meeting happens." "Or on Sorrow Creek during the meeting," she said. "Or both." He turned from the window. "We can't be at the ranch when he comes. We can't miss the meeting either." "No." He looked at her. "So we leave tonight. Go to Sorrow Creek now, a full day early. Get there before Boone has an opportunity to get men in position." She thought about it. "If we leave tonight, he'll know we ran. He'll know the ranch is empty. He might go to Sorrow Creek anyway." "Let him," Voss said, and something in his voice had shifted. Not colder exactly, but settled, the way a man sounds when he's stopped deliberating and started deciding. "Sorrow Creek is not Black Hollow. He doesn't own those people. He doesn't own that land. If he shows up with armed men to disrupt a community meeting in a settlement that isn't under his control, he's not conducting business anymore. He's conducting an attack. And the people in that room will see it." She understood what he meant. Boone's power depended on operating within a system he controlled. The moment he stepped outside that system, the moment he showed his hand openly in front of people who had no obligation to him, the calculation changed. "We want him to come," she said. "We want him to come to the wrong place at the wrong time in front of the wrong witnesses," Voss said. Yes. They left at dusk, taking only what they needed and nothing that couldn't be replaced. Alara packed the cross-referenced documents in the oilskin sleeve Aldred had left behind, rolled tight and tucked inside her coat. Voss took the original records he'd kept back from Aldred's package. The earliest ones, the ones that showed the beginning of the operation and Boone's direct involvement in the first transactions. The ride to Sorrow Creek at night was not comfortable. The trail was familiar enough to Alara now that she didn't take any wrong turns, but the dark made distances feel longer, and the sounds of the valley, insects, the occasional animal moving in the brush, required constant low-level attention that was tiring in a way that daylight didn't produce. They arrived in Sorrow Creek at 10:30, which was late enough that most of the settlement was dark. Nora Hatch had been expecting something like this, or had been expecting something, anyway, which was close enough. She answered the door before Alara had finished knocking, dressed and alert in a way that suggested she hadn't been sleeping. "You're early," she said. "Things moved," Voss said. She looked at them both, then stood back from the door. "Come in, there's room." The community building was a single long room with a plank floor and an iron stove and benches along the walls that could seat roughly 40 people if they didn't mind being close. In the morning, when Alara and Voss had been up for 2 hours already, and the settlement was beginning to stir, Nora walked them through who was coming and from where. 11 families from Sorrow Creek, Goss from Reed Flat, who was bringing 2 other men from his settlement who'd agreed to attend without being told specifically why. Only that it was important and that Nora Hatch had vouched for it. A woman from a homestead 8 miles west, whose name Alara didn't recognize but whose situation Nora described in 3 sentences that were enough. "How many people know the meeting is happening?" Voss asked. "Everyone in Sorrow Creek near enough," Nora said. "I couldn't call a community meeting without it being known." "And someone from Sorrow Creek talks to someone from Black Hollow regularly." "The general store gets supply wagons from Black Hollow twice a month," Nora said. She said it without apology because it was just a fact. "I know. There wasn't a way around it." "No," Voss said. "There wasn't." People began arriving mid-morning. They came in ones and twos and small family groups, with the particular careful manner of people who were attending something they understood was significant, without being entirely sure what form that significance was going to take. They looked at Voss with recognition and varying degrees of wariness. They looked at Alara with more open curiosity, which she was getting used to. Goss arrived at 11. He was a tall man, weathered, with a beard that had grown in unevenly, and eyes that had the reddened quality of someone who'd been sleeping badly for an extended period. He shook Voss's hand and looked at Alara. "You're the one who went into the land office," he said. "Yes," she said. "You're 19 years old," he said. Not as a criticism, more as a fact he was trying to integrate. "I'm aware," she said. He almost smiled. Almost. By noon, 34 people were seated in the community building. Alara stood at the front of the room with the oilskin sleeve in her hands and looked at the faces looking back at her, farmers and ranchers and their wives and a few older children who'd been brought because there was no one to leave them with, and all of them carrying the specific gravity of people who had come because something in their lives wasn't right, and they'd run out of patience for pretending otherwise. She didn't give a speech. She didn't have the disposition for speeches, and she didn't think the room needed one. "Most of you know something about what's been happening in and around Black Hollow," she said. "Some of you have lost someone. Some of you have been pressured to sell land you didn't want to sell, or to stay quiet about things you should have been able to talk about openly. I'm going to show you the documentation that connects all of those things together, and I'm going to explain what we've done with it and what we're asking you to do." She laid it out. Not quickly. She took her time because the time was necessary. She showed them the ledger copies and explained what each column of figures represented. She showed them the cross-referenced records and traced the connection between the financial transactions and the names they recognized. Nora Hatch stood up and spoke about her sister, which she did in a flat, steady voice that cost her something and made the room very quiet. Goss spoke about his daughter in 2 sentences because that was all he had left. The room was different after those 2 had spoken. It had the particular charge of people who'd been carrying something alone for a long time and had just discovered that the thing they were carrying had a shape, that it was real and documented and shared. Voss spoke last and briefly, explaining the package that Aldred was carrying to Calder and what they expected a federal response to look like and how long it would realistically take. 3 weeks to a month before a marshal arrives, he said, possibly longer. The question is whether Boone moves first. He will, said a man near the back, a rancher from the north end of Sorrow Creek named Birch, who had said nothing until now and had the manner of someone who spent his words carefully. Boone doesn't wait when he feels threatened. He's already threatened. He'll come. I know, Voss said. So what do we do? You go home today, Voss said, and you write down everything you know, names, dates, anything specific. You sign it. If you're willing, you bring it to the federal office in Calder when the marshal comes. You don't have to, but if you're willing... I'm willing, Nora said. I'm willing, Goss said without hesitation. Others said the same, not in unison, but in the sequential, independent way of people making individual decisions that happen to align. Alara counted 11. 11 separate signed accounts to add to the ledger copies and the financial records and Aldred's professional certification. It was, she thought, enough. It had to be. The meeting broke up at mid-afternoon. People filtered out in small groups, heading back to their separate properties and lives, carrying the knowledge of the room with them. Alara stood at the door and watched them go and tried to calculate the probability that Boone was already moving and arrived at a number she didn't want to think about too precisely. Voss appeared beside her. He'd been talking quietly to Birch, and from the expression on Birch's face as the man walked away, the conversation had involved something more specific than testimony. What did you ask him? She said. To organize some of the men from Sorrow Creek, he said. Volunteers, people who are willing to be present at the ranch tonight. She looked at him. You think tonight? I think Boone heard about this meeting, and I think he's been watching our movements, and I think he has enough assembled men to move when he's ready, and he's almost ready. He was watching the last of the meeting attendees disappear down the trail. The ranch is where he'll go. It's the obvious target. He wants to destroy the documentation and deal with us in a place he controls. But we're not at the ranch. No, Voss said, but we could be. She understood what he was suggesting. The ranch is bait. Bring Boone's men to a specific location at a time they chose, with witnesses already in position. That's not strategy, she said. That's a trap. Yes, he said. How many men does Birch have? 8. Maybe 10 if 2 others agree. Boone will have more than that. Probably, he said. But Boone's men are hired men. Most of them have no particular stake in this beyond their wages. Birch's men are protecting their own land and their own families. That's a different kind of fighting. He paused. And we don't need to win a fight. We need witnesses to see Boone order an attack on private property. That's all. She thought about this for a long moment. Outside, the Sorrow Creek afternoon was quiet, with a wind moving through the cottonwood trees along the creek bed, and a sound of children somewhere beyond the general store. Ordinary sounds. The sounds of a place that had not yet been touched by what was happening and deserved to stay that way. If we go back to the ranch tonight, she said, and Boone brings 20 men, then we have a problem, Voss said. I know. I want you to say it clearly, she said, not to scare me, because I need to actually understand what I'm agreeing to. He looked at her and answered her honestly, the way he always did, which she'd come to understand as the particular form his respect took. If it goes wrong, we're in serious danger. Birch's men are good, but 10 is not 20, and Boone will have Webb, who is better than most of the men around him. He paused. There's a real chance this ends badly. And if we don't go back, she said, we wait. We stay scattered. We hope the marshal comes before Boone moves against the outlying families who signed testimony today, which he will, once he figures out who was in that room. She thought about Nora Hatch's face when she'd talked about her sister, about Goss's 2 sentences that had cost him everything they contained, about the 11 people who'd stood up in that room and said they were willing. We go back tonight, she said. He nodded once. They rode back to the ranch in the late afternoon, arriving just before dark. Birch's men came in from different directions over the following 2 hours, not in a group, which would have been visible, but separately, tying horses in the dry creek bed behind the property and moving up through the scrub brush to the ranch on foot. 8 of them. Alara recognized one from the meeting. The others were strangers with the faces of men who'd made a decision and were past reconsidering it. Voss positioned them with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd thought through the geography of this specific confrontation in advance. Alara understood, seeing the placement, that he'd been planning this longer than the afternoon, that the possibility of turning the ranch into a trap had been in his thinking for days, maybe since Webb's first visit. He hadn't shared it because there hadn't been a need to, and because he was a man who didn't circulate plans that weren't complete yet. She took a position inside the house, near the front window, with a clear line of sight to the main approach. Voss was outside, somewhere in the dark between the barn and the corral, invisible to her but present. She could feel it, which was either instinct or the product of 6 days of knowing a person more intensely than she'd known anyone in years. The night settled in, hot and still and full of insects. She waited. At 10:30, the horses came. She heard them before she saw them, more than she'd hoped, fewer than she'd feared. She counted the sounds, maybe 15, moving at a deliberate pace down the main trail toward the ranch, not trying to be quiet, which told her Boone had decided the threat of numbers was more useful than the advantage of surprise. He'd expected them to be frightened. He'd expected them to see the riders coming and make a calculation about how badly they wanted to keep fighting. What he hadn't expected, couldn't have expected, because it was the thing he'd never needed to account for in 4 years of doing this, was that the people in that ranch had already made their calculation and arrived at a different answer than the one he'd anticipated. The riders came into the yard. Boone was among them. She could see him in the moonlight, that upright posture, that particular stillness of a man who'd arranged for other people to take risks on his behalf for so long that he'd forgotten what his own risk felt like. Webb was there. On Boone's left, slightly forward, scanning the buildings with the professional attention of a man doing threat assessment. Alara stood very still by the window and waited for what came next. Boone didn't call out right away. He sat his horse in the middle of the yard and looked at the dark house and the dark barn and the dark corral, and he took his time with it, the way a man does when he's accustomed to having time to take. 15 riders spread loosely behind him, Webb 2 lengths to his left, already studying the angles. Alara watched from the window, motionless. "Voss," Boone said finally. Not a shout. A carrying voice, the kind developed for giving orders across wide spaces. "I know you're in there. Come out and we'll talk like reasonable men." Silence. "I'm going to count that as you needing a moment," Boone said, with the particular patience of someone who believes the outcome is already decided. "Take your time." Webb leaned slightly toward him and said something low. Boone shook his head once. Then Voss's voice came from somewhere to the right of the barn, not from inside the house at all, which Alara could see recalibrated something in Webb's posture immediately. "I can hear you fine from here," Voss said. "What do you want to talk about?" Boone turned his horse toward the sound. "I want to talk about the mistake you've been making for 3 years, he said, and about how there's still a version of this where you ride out of this territory with your life intact." "That's a generous offer," Voss said. "What's the version where I don't?" "You're looking at it," Boone said. The yard was quiet for a moment. An owl called somewhere out in the brush and didn't repeat itself. "There's something you should know," Voss said, "before this goes any further. The documentation, the ledger copies, the transaction records, the signed testimony from 11 families in this valley. It left for Calder 2 days ago. It's already in federal hands, or it will be within the next 24 hours. Whatever happens tonight doesn't change that." A silence, shorter than Alara would have expected. "You're bluffing," Boone said. "I'm not a man who bluffs," Voss said. "You know that about me, or you should by now." Webb spoke to Boone again, more urgently this time. Boone's hand came up and cut him off. "Even if that's true," Boone said, and his voice had shifted slightly. Not frightened, not yet, but recalculating. "Documentation without witnesses is just paper. Marshals need people willing to stand up in front of a judge, and people in this territory have a way of reconsidering their willingness." "They do," Voss agreed. "That's been true for 4 years. It's why you've been able to operate as long as you have." A pause. "But I want you to look to your left." Boone looked left. So did Webb. So did most of the riders behind them. Birch stepped out from the shadow of the dry creek bed. Then the men with him, not rushing, not dramatic, just becoming visible, one at a time, in the positions they'd taken up over the preceding hours. 8 men with rifles spread across the left flank of the property in a line that covered the yard and the trail back toward the main road simultaneously. It wasn't a large force. Alara knew that, and Voss knew that, and Boone certainly knew that. But it changed the geometry of the confrontation in ways that mattered. There was no longer a direction that was clearly safe for Boone's men to move in, which was different from being surrounded. Being surrounded was a military situation. This was something more specific. It was witnesses. Armed ones, present ones, men with names and properties and families, and absolutely no obligation to Cassidy Boone. Boone's horse shifted under him. He stilled it. Alara opened the front door of the house and walked out. She was almost certain she heard, Voss make a short sound behind the barn that was either a suppressed objection or something else entirely. She kept walking until she was standing on the edge of the porch, clearly visible in the moonlight, with nothing between her and the 15 riders in the yard. Boone looked at her. Something moved across his face. "Miss Quinn," he said. "Mr. Boone," she said, "you rode out here tonight to do something you can't take back in front of 10 men who have nothing to gain from keeping quiet about it. I want to make sure you've thought that through. You're a 19-year-old girl who went into Crawley's land office and identified the ledger," she said, "who rode to Sorrow Creek and put together a room full of people with documented grievances against your operation, who has spent the last 6 days making sure that everything you've done for 4 years is written down and signed and on its way to a federal office." She kept her voice level. Not cold. She wasn't performing coldness. She was just tired and clear, and past the point where managing his feelings about her felt like a useful investment of her attention. "You can call me a girl if you want. It doesn't change any of those facts." The yard was very still. Webb was the one she was actually watching. Not Boone. Boone was the authority. But Webb was the one who would move first if someone was going to move, and his hands had shifted slightly in the last 30 seconds toward a position that wasn't quite reaching for a weapon, but wasn't neutral either. "Webb," she said, looking directly at him, "you were at Nora Hatch's property 2 years ago, 2 days before her sister Mara disappeared. Nora saw you, and she described you specifically, and that description is in the documentation that went to Calder." Webb went very still. "That's a different kind of problem than what Mr. Boone has," she said. "Mr. Boone organized and financed. You were present. That distinction matters to a federal court." "Shut her up," Webb said, to no one in particular and everyone at once. Nobody moved. It was the moment that everything depended on. Not the weapons, not the numbers, but this. Whether the men Boone had brought with him tonight had enough stake in the outcome to act on his behalf when acting meant making themselves part of something they could no longer claim ignorance of. Hired men who'd ridden out thinking this was an intimidation call, a property dispute. The usual kind of late-night pressure that Boone's operations occasionally required. Not men who'd signed up for what Webb was now suggesting. One of the riders at the back turned his horse. He didn't say anything. He just turned and walked the horse out of the yard at an even pace and kept going, and the sound of his departure in the silence was very loud. Then another. Boone turned in his saddle. "Stay where you are," he said, with the authority of a man who had never had to say that sentence before because it had never been necessary. It didn't work the way it used to. 2 more riders moved, then a third, who said, "I got a family, Cassidy," and left without waiting for a response. Within 4 minutes, there were 6 men left in the yard. Boone, Webb, and 4 others who either had more to lose from defection or less imagination about what was coming. Birch's men hadn't moved. They didn't need to. Voss came around the side of the barn and walked into the yard, and he stopped about 10 feet from Boone's horse and looked up at the man with those gray eyes that didn't have a lot of theater in them. "It's over," he said. Simply, just a fact. Boone looked at him for a long time. In the moonlight, his face was complicated. Not broken, not quite, because men like Boone don't break cleanly, they crack in directions that are hard to predict. What she could see was that he was running calculations and finding that none of them were coming out right anymore, and that the experience of this was genuinely unfamiliar to him. He'd been the man with the right numbers for so long that he didn't have a practiced response for the alternative. "You have no authority," Boone said finally. "You're one man with a grudge and a girl who should have kept her head down. Whatever you've sent to Calder, my lawyers—" "Your lawyers," Voss said, "will read the ledger and the cross-reference transaction records, and 11 signed statements from families across this valley, and the professional certification of a licensed land surveyor who documented the chain of evidence." He paused. "And then they'll tell you what your options are. But they'll tell you that privately, and what happens publicly will be something else." Boone's jaw was tight. His horse shifted again. "Webb acted on your orders," Voss said. "That's in the records. The payments are in the records. You're not a man who did a thing. You're a man who built a system for doing a thing, and systems leave better evidence than actions do. You know that. You used that against other people for years." Something in Boone's face shifted, finally, into something that was less controlled than anything she'd seen on him before. Not fear, exactly. More the look of a man who has realized that the room he's been operating in has different dimensions than he thought, and that the walls he believed were behind him are actually in front. He looked at Alara. She didn't look away. He turned his horse and rode out. Webb held his position for another moment, looking at Alara with an expression that she filed away carefully because it was the kind of expression that meant something wasn't finished. And then he followed. The 4 remaining riders went without ceremony. The yard was empty. Alara sat down on the porch step because her legs had made a decision without consulting her, and put her hands on her knees and breathed. Birch came across the yard. Voss came from the other direction. They converged near the porch and stood for a moment in the specific silence of people who have been at high tension for hours and are in the process of the body reclaiming itself. "Webb will run," Birch said. "Probably," Voss said. "Should we—" "The marshal will deal with Webb," Voss said. "That's what marshals are for." He looked at Birch. "Thank you. You and your men. Tonight mattered." Birch nodded once. "We're not doing it for you," he said. Not unkindly, just accurately. "We're doing it because it needed doing." "I know," Voss said. Birch went back to his men, and the sound of them collecting their horses from the creek bed carried through the night air, and then they were gone too, and it was just the 2 of them again in the yard of a ranch that looked exactly the same as it had an hour ago and was completely different. Voss sat down on the step beside her, not close, but present. Neither of them spoke for a while. "Webb's face," she said eventually. "I saw it. He's going to be a problem." "For a while," Voss said, "until he isn't." He said it without elaboration, and she understood he meant that Webb running was better than Webb staying, and that a man running from a federal warrant in the Western Territories in 1883 had a limited set of futures available to him. She nodded. The stars over the valley were dense and very bright, the way they get in places far enough from town that the darkness is real darkness. She'd grown up under these same stars, and had never particularly noticed them before. She noticed them now. "What happens to Black Hollow?" she said. "It depends on how many people were involved and how deep it goes," Voss said. "The sheriff will be arrested. Crawley will likely cooperate in exchange for a reduced charge. He's not brave enough for anything else. Boone's properties will go into some kind of legal proceeding that takes longer than it should and ends with less consequence than it deserves." He paused. "That's the honest answer. It won't be clean. It won't be total. Some people who should face charges will manage to avoid them. That's how it goes." "That's not very satisfying," she said. "No," he agreed, "but the operation ends. That part's complete. The people in those ledgers, the ones who were moved after Aldred's earliest documented date, there's a record now, and a legal mechanism, and people whose job it is to follow it. That's not nothing." She thought about the girl from Black Hollow, whose name she'd seen in Crawley's notation, with the destination and the payment and no further record. She thought about what Voss had said that first morning at the table. "Some of them I can't track. Some of them he couldn't track." That was the weight that didn't go away, and she didn't try to resolve it into something more bearable than it was. It was the weight of a thing that had gone on too long before anyone stopped it, and the people who bore that weight most heavily were not the ones sitting on this porch. "My uncle," she said. "He'll be in the documentation," Voss said. He provided names and access. That's participation, legally. I know. She was quiet. I don't feel what I expected to feel about that. What did you expect? Something cleaner, she said. He's a terrible person who did a terrible thing. I expected to feel satisfied about what's coming for him. She looked at her hands. Instead, I just feel tired. And like the last real family, I had turned out to be something I'm going to have to figure out what to do with for a long time. Voss didn't offer her a way to feel better about that. She appreciated it. You could leave, he said after a while. When this is done, go east, somewhere new, start without any of this attached to your name. I could, she said, or you could stay. She looked at him. Sorrow Creek needs a proper school, he said, with the slightly careful manner of someone making a point while pretending not to. Birch mentioned it tonight. There are 40 children in that settlement with nowhere to get educated. I'm not a school teacher, she said. You're the most organized person I've met in 3 years of living in this valley, he said. And you're 19, which means you have time to figure out the rest. She looked at him for a moment. This man with the worn trail clothes and the careful eyes, and the 3 years of lonely, costly work spread across a table in a ranch house that smelled like dust and old paper. He was not a romantic figure in the way stories made such men out to be. He was difficult in private and had spent so long operating alone that adjusting to another person's presence required effort. She could see him making in real time, daily. He was also, she had come to understand, one of the most genuinely principled people she'd ever known, in the specific way that principle looks when it's not performed for anyone, when it's just the way a person moves through the world when they think nobody's watching. What would you do, she said, if I stayed? He thought about it. Seriously, which she expected. Keep working the ranch, he said. Help Sorrow Creek build that school if you're interested. Try to be of some use in getting the settlements in this valley connected enough that Boone or someone like him can't isolate them again. He paused. Have someone to argue with about strategy. You hate arguing about strategy, she said. I hate losing arguments about strategy, he said. There's a difference. She almost laughed. Not quite. She was too tired for a full laugh. But almost. The federal marshal arrived in Black Hollow 19 days later. His name was Harding, and he came with 2 deputies and a letter of authority from the territorial governor and the particular efficient gravity of a man who'd read a large file before he got on his horse and understood what he was riding into. Aldred had done his job thoroughly. The package he'd delivered to Calder was, in Harding's words, the most organized piece of documentary evidence he'd received in 11 years of federal service. He said this to Alara, who was present at the first formal interview, and he said it with a quality of surprise that she chose not to remark on. Boone was arrested at the Ironwood on a Tuesday morning. He came out of the house in his good coat, which seemed like a choice, and he didn't resist, which seemed like a calculation. His lawyers arrived from the territorial capital 4 days later and began the long, grinding work of managing a situation that couldn't be managed away, only minimized. It would take 2 years of legal proceedings to fully resolve. The outcome would be, as Voss had predicted, less complete than justice demanded and more complete than 4 years of silence had produced. The sheriff was arrested the same day as Boone. He cooperated almost immediately, which told the full story of what kind of man he'd always been. Crawley cooperated too, as predicted, and what he gave the marshal in exchange for his reduced charge was a set of names and connections that extended the investigation beyond Black Hollow into 3 neighboring counties and implicated 7 additional people who had believed themselves safely adjacent to the operation without being technically part of it. The idea that you could profit from proximity to a thing without being accountable for it turned out, in this specific case, to be incorrect. That outcome was not complete, but it was something. Webb was found 6 weeks later in a settlement near the border, identified by a description that Nora Hatch had provided. He was extradited. His trial was the one that took the longest and produced the clearest result, because the evidence against him was the most specific. Nora Hatch testified in person. She sat in the wooden chair in the territorial courtroom and said her sister's name and described what she'd seen. And she did it without her voice breaking, which was its own kind of courage, not the dramatic kind, not the kind that gets written down in the simplified versions of events, but the real kind. The kind that just keeps going because stopping is the only alternative and stopping isn't acceptable. Dade Quinn, Ilara's uncle, was convicted of conspiracy and received a sentence that felt simultaneously too short and complicated to be angry about, because he was still, underneath everything, the man who had taught her to read on winter evenings when he'd still been a different version of himself, or maybe just a version she hadn't understood yet. She went to see him once, before the sentencing. She didn't know entirely why. She sat across a table from him in the territorial jail and looked at him, and he looked at the table, and after a long silence he said, "I needed the money," as if that were an explanation. She said, "I know," because she did know. Not the gambling, not the specific debt, but the shape of a man who'd been losing ground for years and had looked for the quickest exit from the feeling of it without counting who he was standing on. She understood the shape without forgiving it, which was the best she could do and the most she thought was honest. She left and didn't go back. Black Hollow changed. Not overnight, not completely, not in the clean transformation that the simplified version of events might suggest. It changed the way places change when the structure that was organizing them disappears, awkwardly, with arguments and false starts, and a period of genuine uncertainty about what it was going to become. The sheriff's office got a new occupant, a younger man from 2 counties east who asked more questions than his predecessor and wasn't afraid of the answers. The land office got new management after Crawley's departure. The Copper Bell stayed open under different ownership that had nothing to do with the previous arrangement and served better whiskey, according to Birch, which was a low bar but a cleared one. The women who had stood at the back of the auction crowd and not quite looked away. Some of them became part of what came next, and some of them didn't. Ilara didn't judge the ones who didn't because she knew enough by now about the mathematics of fear and responsibility and the gap between them to understand that people are not sorted neatly into the brave and the cowardly. Most people are something more complicated and context-dependent than either of those categories, and the question isn't always who acts and who doesn't. It's whether, when someone acts, there's enough in place that the action means something. She thought about that often, about what it meant that one person showing up, Voss on his horse, placing a bid in a morning auction, had been the thing that started the rest. Not because he was exceptional, because he was present and he made a choice, and the choice had consequences that neither of them could have predicted in full at the time. That's how most things that matter actually happen. Not through plans, not through certainty, but through someone deciding to do the next thing when the next thing is in front of them, without knowing what it leads to. She stayed in the valley. This was not a dramatic decision. It was a series of smaller decisions that accumulated into permanence without any single moment of declaration. She helped plan the school in Sorrow Creek. She was not a natural teacher, discovered she had strong opinions about what children should be taught and how, and learned to moderate approximately 40% of those opinions for the sake of getting along with the community parents who were funding the effort. The remaining 60% she held firm on because some things were worth the argument and she'd never been good at pretending otherwise. Nora Hatch became something she didn't have a precise word for. Not quite a friend, not quite a sister, something in the specific register of 2 women who had been through adjacent terrible things and come out on the same side of them with a mutual respect that didn't require constant maintenance. They argued sometimes, about practical things, and the arguments were always resolved and never lingered. Voss kept the ranch and expanded it modestly, which was the version of ambition that suited him. Not dramatic growth, just the steady, incremental improvement of something he'd committed to. He was, as he'd always been, difficult to know past a certain depth, and the difficulty didn't decrease significantly over time. She'd stopped expecting it to. Some people are not designed for easy revelation, and learning to be at peace with that was its own form of growth. They were, between them, something that the frontier didn't have clean language for, not the simple romantic pairing that stories preferred, not just colleagues, not exactly friends, but some combination of all of these things that had been built under unusual pressure and had consequently a different kind of strength than things built under easier circumstances. It had flaws. It had silences that lasted too long sometimes, and disagreements that took days to resolve, and the regular ordinary friction of 2 people with strong and not always compatible instincts trying to share a decision. It was real in the way that imperfect things are real, not despite the flaws, but partly because of them. She was 20 years old when the school in Sorrow Creek opened, in a building that Birch's men built over 6 weekends with lumber donated from 4 different families and a roof that leaked in the corner until Voss spent an afternoon on it and fixed it without being asked. There were 14 children on the first day. She stood in front of them and looked at their faces, wary, curious, bored, alert, and thought about what she wanted to give them that she'd had to find for herself, late and at cost. Not safety, exactly. Safety was not something she could guarantee, and promising things she couldn't guarantee had never been her habit. But something adjacent to it, the knowledge that the world had rules and that the rules could be understood, and that understanding them was not the same as being powerless within them. That documentation mattered, and testimony mattered, and showing up mattered, even when showing up was frightening, maybe especially then. She thought about the auction platform, the rough-hewn boards under her shoes, the 31 people in the crowd, the ones who bid and the ones who stayed silent, and the ones who couldn't quite look away. She thought about what it had meant to stand there and not bow her head, not because she was fearless, because she wasn't, but because the alternative was something she couldn't accept. Not every act of refusal leads somewhere. She knew that. She'd known people who'd refused the same kinds of things and hadn't been rescued by anyone on a dark bay horse, and their stories didn't have tidy resolutions. The world was not organized around the principle that courage is rewarded. It was organized around no principle at all, which was precisely why the people in it had to provide their own. But sometimes the refusal was the beginning of the thing. Sometimes standing in the morning light and keeping your chin up and looking back at the crowd was the act that made everything else possible. Not because it was powerful in itself, but because it was the first link in a chain that nobody, including the person forging it, could see the full length of yet. She looked at the 14 children in the first row of the Sorrow Creek schoolhouse. "My name is Alara Quinn," she said. "We're going to start with reading. After that, we're going to do arithmetic. And eventually," she set the primer down on the desk in front of her, "we're going to talk about the law, about what it is and what it's for, and what happens when the people who are supposed to enforce it decide not to." A boy in the second row, 7 years old, gap-toothed, with the expression of a child who has already decided whether he likes a situation before it's fully begun, said, "My pa says the law is just for rich people." "Your pa's not wrong," Alara said, "but that's exactly why we need to understand it." The boy thought about this, nodded slowly with the gravity of someone taking a position. Outside the window, the valley ran away toward the horizon in all directions, flat and dry and enormous, full of the particular stubborn beauty of a place that hadn't decided to be hospitable and didn't particularly care whether you found it pleasant. The sky was the color of pale copper at the edges, where the sun was making its way up. The cottonwoods along the creek were moving in a wind that hadn't reached the building yet. Black Hollow was 4 miles south. It was still there, still a town, still in the process of becoming something that it hadn't been before. Not good, not transformed, but different, and difference was a start. Alara picked up the primer. The day's work began.